I believe we're very fortunate at Hobart and William Smith Colleges to have a dry point by American Impressionist artist Mary Cassatt. This 1905 work shows a mother and child. In this particular case, we actually know the identity of the mother, a friend of Mary Cassatt, Antoine. And Mary Cassatt is possibly one of the three most important Impressionist female artists of the 19th century and early 20th century. And her body of work represents a unicum in the context of the Impressionist movement, particularly because it focuses almost systematically on the relationship between mother and child. As we can see from this image, Mary Cassatt is actually particularly interested in exploring the emotional dynamic between mother and child, a dynamic that seems to exclude the viewer. In fact, the artist represents both mother and child looking off to the distance. They do not look out of the picture at the viewer. We are therefore excluded from the subject's attention. We're not quite sure what they're focused on, but we do know that their focus is shared, and that intimacy is particularly emphasized by the manner in which the heads of mother and child come together, the manner in which the eyes of mother and child are at the same level. The artist has further emphasized that idea by carefully working out and shadowing in chiaroscuro the images of the heads, whereas the body seems to slowly disappear into nothingness. We have very few lines that give us in the end a corporeal presence. The presence is really all in that shared touch, in that shared physical touch between mother and child. And this subject is really a unicum in the Impressionist context, because most male artists tended to focus on either the everyday life or on young, seductive young women. Whereas Mary Cassatt felt that instead she wanted to approach the female subject on a completely different level. Interestingly, what she ends up doing in the end is reworking the conventional type of the Virgin Mary and child. And I think this can be immediately seen in this type of imagery. But whereas in the representation of the Virgin Mary and child, the artist usually focused either on the Virgin, so the female presence, or on the child, that is the male presence, and of course for religious reason at this point. In this case, the artist moves beyond the conventional type to actually focuses on the emotional relationship, on the psychological dynamic as well that exists between the two figures. It's not deposited within one figure or the other, but it's really about the interaction between the two. In fact, the artist refused to use professional models, exactly because she wanted to capture these very natural and instinctual relationships. And for that reason, she used friends, or she used neighbors that she knew. Oftentimes, she paid close attention to the manner in which women of the lower classes handled children, because many of them ended up working as nurses or nursemaids in the household of the elite classes, and seemed to be much more at ease in handling children than women of the elite classes. When scholars look at this type of imagery, on the one hand, they've suggested that, of course, Mary Cassatt participated in the construction of the 19th century ideal of motherhood, which is rather interesting considering that she was an American artist who spent most of her life in France, refused to marry or to have children. So she actually lived according to dictates that at the time would have been seen as more masculine rather than feminine. And so her focus on this mother-child relationship, on motherhood itself, may be understood in the end not just as a romantic vision of motherhood, but instead as a narrow gap that allowed the artist to explore the female subject outside of the constraints of the male-imposed gaze. In fact, these images seem to refuse the presence of a male, reject the presence of a male figure. The mother is completely absorbed in the child, as the child is completely absorbed in the feminine world that the mother represents. Also the emphasis on the emotion, on that delicate emotion and exchange between mother and child, seems to be once again rejecting that male gaze that, as we've mentioned before, in the 19th century tended to present women either as object of erotic interest or as object of everyday life interest.